So one of the inquiries that I've seen circling around for such a long time is, can the freak Pyro control the flares of the human light in Wonder Comics? The response is yes. And as a matter of fact, it truly occurred in Wonder Undertaking's Bugman issue number 31 back in like 2007 or something to that effect. There is somewhat of a proviso. We'll discuss that as we get past this and toward the end. I will give you folks a few accomplishments of the insane things that Pyro has done. So this at first opens up with the human light showing up at Peter Parker's school, and the motivation behind for what reason is on the grounds that everyone's eager to see him. Right, he's an individual from the fabulous for the principal genuine group of superheroes in Wonder Comics, yet when he shows up in Midtown Secondary School, he quickly fails to keep a grip on his powers. In a real sense, he resembles my Blaze's copying Wild. How can that even be? And afterward, he begins zooming around, yet apparently, despite his desire to the contrary, right, he resembles in a real sense I got to leave before I put a match to the entire grounds, and he's like something is making me fly right toward these units. And like he goes barreling into them practically, right. Peter Parker obviously sunrises the Bugman ensemble and afterward goes to battle Johnny Tempest. It's anything but an excessively perplexing battle. Again, this story is moderately short, yet Peter Parker, obviously being Bugman, his bug sense is actually the main thing that permits him to acquire the advantage, yet Peter Parker doesn't actually have the foggiest idea what's going on. Even the nearest that we get are only proclamations from Johnny Tempest, where he's making statements like, got to figure out how to break liberated from anything that's doing this. I can't switch my fire off. It's not influenced quite a bit by thus. At last he barrels towards Bugman and the battle breaks out between the two, now obviously Bugman bouncing and winding around, evading wherever that he can, attempting to essentially move, and what he winds up doing is webbing up Johnny Tempest, and Johnny Tempest, obviously being encased in Peter Parker's flame-resistant webbing, is basically stuck immediately. Now that is one of the provisos that I would like to examine when we get to the furthest limit of this, before we get into the insane things that Pyro has done, and the way that he could presumably solo the Vindicators. Yet, with Johnny Tempest briefly debilitated, Peter Parker goes on the chase after what's going on, standing by listening to the things that Johnny Tempest is saying, and the way that Johnny Tempest is a hero, he clearly wouldn't go barreling into a horde of individuals. That has neither rhyme nor reason. Thus at last Peter finds Pyro. Now we're not exactly given a ton of setting concerning how he did it, right. The Wonder Experience comics were less about coherence, checking out, and were more about only sort of having some good times yet safeguarding the idea of the characters. Thus once Peter Parker finds Pyro, that he offers this expression. He says, not so intense when you don't have the human light to control, or you so, except if you have another stunt at your disposal. And afterward obviously Pyro goes in for the assault. Currently, here's the huge kicker about Pyro: doesn't can make fire, yet Pyro have some control over fire. He controls one of the major powers of EX presence, as that is the reason he's constantly got like flamethrowers connected to him, so he can touch off a fire and afterward do basically anything he desires with it. And what you see him doing here with Peter Parker transforming it into like a Goliath beast that pursues him multiple times out of 10 when a Wonder Writer is keen on utilizing his personality yet doesn't have any desire to stretch him to the edges of what he can truly do. This is how things are playing out, right, like making beasts and sending them after individuals and various things. Thusly, obviously Bugman assaults him, sends them flying through the lookout window, for which fundamentally the pool Pyro crashes and it drenches his flares quickly, and afterward like Johnny Tempest punches him, and he's fundamentally given over to the police. There is a smidgen of work here, right, where Johnny Tempest asked like, what was your inspiration driving doing this? Everything sort of boils down to a straightforward inspiration, right. The Pyro himself accepts he ought to be more famous than Johnny Tempest is on the grounds that Johnny Tempest can transform himself into fire, or depending how old-fashioned you need to go in Wonder Comics, encase himself in fire, though Pyro controls that key power. So generally Pyro controls the powers that Johnny Tempest has, thus he accepts that he ought to have more reputation. Obviously perpetrating to criminal demonstrations will draw some unacceptable sort of consideration Pyro's given to the police, and that is essentially it. Now, before we get into the accomplishments of Pyro and the things that he's done, I would like to discuss these provisos briefly. So Johnny Tempest is strong by his own doing, yet he's not this sort of an all-be-all power of nature, because of his capacity to control fire, and, surprisingly, then, at that point, it's Sort of a misnomer. Johnny Tempest truly more than anything encases himself in a kind of plasma fire rather than truly transforming himself into fire now, as a rule, as a result of how he's portrayed in Wonder Comics. It's 6 out of one hand, about 6 in the other, yet the reality stays. In stories like Phenomenal for issue number 391, it was laid out by Galactus that while Johnny Tempest's power was not sufficiently to obliterate Galactus himself, that even Galactus perceived how strong Johnny was, and that is coming from a grandiose element that doesn't actually give a lot of consideration to anyone other than himself. And Awesome for Volume 1 issue number 32, it was demonstrated that he could retain fire regardless of whether it was made by someone else who could make fire, which would truly loan trustworthiness to the possibility that he could most likely overwhelm Pyro. And as a matter of fact, this was developed in Odd Stories issue number 112 when he consumed an atomic blast, obviously Johnny Tempest additionally has different shortcomings, the most remarkable of which was shrouded in Awesome for 306, which is that you can truly splash the flares that he produces and return him to his typical human structure. Yet I say this to say the way that Johnny Tempest could be shrouded or encased in Bugman's enemy of fire web liquid and afterward some way or another be crippled would show this rendition of Johnny Storm in the story isn't so strong as Johnny Tempest is customarily viewed as being in Wonder Comics, particularly when you consider the way that in Astounding Bugman issue number 790, when Bugman battled Johnny Storm in the primary Wonder Universe, Spider-Man had absolutely no chance of killing Johnny Tempest utilizing his web liquid, yet zeroing in on Pyro and the things that he's done. Again, he's unbelievably strong in Wonder Comics. In Uncanny X-Men issue number 338, in a battle among himself and the X-Men, Pyro was truly ready to burn the playing a card game of a large number of ploys tossed them, yet before they were ever ready to hit Pyro, albeit in all decency, I believe it's critical to express that in this specific comic Pyro was tainted with the inheritance infection, essentially helps free freaks, yet it amped his powers so he regularly could not have possibly had the option to follow through with something like this. Yet in Uncanny X-Men issue number 177, he very warmed Mammoth to the point the monster truly became white-hot, verging to the point that he practically liquefied. And in Wonder Presents issue number 85, it was laid out that Pyro have some control over all possible types of intensity, not just fire. Thus, while this isn't really intended to influence you without a doubt with respect to whether Pyro would have the option to overcome Johnny Tempest the way that he have some control over the size, the shape, the force of any sort of intensity that he appears to be, well as being shielded from the impacts of fire himself, it truly makes areas of strength for that Pyro could surpass Johnny Tempest and rout Johnny Tempest. Honestly, inside Wonder Comics, not just that he could likely interpretation of the Vindicators. The best piece of proof for this comes in the Unimaginable Mass issue number 369 during Peter David's run, when Pyro truly matches the staggering mass and strength and stands his ground against him. I mean, actually it was the incomparable mass, so particularly not so solid as the customary mind-boggling mass, but rather like I'd in any case prefer to accept that Pyro can do it. Let me have my fantasy. So folks, we will finish this ideally. This responded to whether Pyro could truly overcome Johnny Tempest. I realize we kind of went off on a cycle of a digression, yet let me in on what you all figure down in the remarks, and I will look you all up some other time. Harmony. So one of the inquiries that I've seen flowing around for such a long time is, can the freak Pyro control the blazes of the human light in Wonder Comics? The response is yes, and truth be told, it truly occurred in Wonder Experiences Bugman issue number 31 back in 2007 or something to that effect. There is a digit of a proviso. We'll discuss that as we traverse this, and toward the end I will give you all a few accomplishments of the insane things that Pyro has done. So this at first opens up with the human light showing up at Peter Parker's school, and the motivation behind for what reason is on the grounds that everyone's simply eager to see him. Right, he's an individual from the Awesome for the main genuine group of superheroes in Wonder Comics, yet when he shows up in Midtown Secondary School he promptly fails to keep a grip on his powers. In a real sense he resembles my flares copying crazy. How can that even be? And afterward he begins zooming around, yet apparently despite his desire to the contrary, right, he resembles, in a real sense, I got to leave before I put a match to the entire grounds, and he's like something is making me fly right toward these packs, and like he goes barreling into them practically right. Peter Parker, obviously Dave, breaks the Bugman outfit and afterward goes to battle Johnny Tempest. It's anything but an excessively complicated battle. Again, this story is moderately short, yet Peter Parker, obviously being Bugman, his bug say,